The summer evening of July 16th, 1988, stretched across the Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro like a golden blanket woven from Brazilian sunshine and the collective dreams of nearly 1 million human souls who had gathered to witness what many believed would be impossible until this very moment. 907,000 fans filled every conceivable space in and around the massive stadium, spilling into the streets, climbing onto rooftops, perching in trees, creating a human tapestry that extended far beyond the venue's official capacity and transformed the entire neighborhood into a pilgrimage site for those who had traveled from across South America to be present for this historic evening. The air itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, so thick it was almost tangible, while the distant sound of samba drums mixed with the gentle murmur of voices speaking in Portuguese, Spanish, and dozens of other languages, creating a linguistic symphony that spoke to the universal power of music to transcend cultural boundaries. Michael Jackson stood in the tunnel beneath the stadium, his sequined military jacket catching the fluorescent lights like captured starlight, while around him his security team and production crew moved with the careful precision of people who understood they were about to facilitate something that had never been attempted before in the history of live entertainment. The logistics of performing for nearly 1 million people presented challenges that pushed the boundaries of technology and human organization, requiring sound systems that could carry his voice to the furthest reaches of the crowd, video screens large enough to make his image visible to people standing nearly a mile from the stage, and security protocols designed to manage the movement of a population larger than many entire cities. But beyond the technical complexities lay something more profound and more challenging. The emotional weight of performing for the largest audience any solo artist had ever faced, a responsibility that went beyond entertainment to become something approaching a sacred trust between performer and audience. Michael had spent the previous 3 days in meditation and prayer, understanding that this evening would require him to reach deeper into his artistic and spiritual reserves than any performance in his career, to find a way to connect authentically with nearly 1 million individual hearts, while maintaining the intimacy that had always been the secret source of his power as a performer. The roar from the stadium had been building steadily for hours, a sound that seemed to come not from human throats, but from the earth itself, a geological phenomenon created by the collective energy of people who had been waiting in the July heat since dawn, many of whom had slept in the streets the night before to ensure their place at this historic gathering. The Brazilian organizers had warned Michael's team that South American audiences were different from those in North America or Europe, that the passion and emotional investment of Brazilian fans created an intensity that could be overwhelming even for experienced performers. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of nearly 1 million people unified in their devotion to an artist they considered not just an entertainer, but a spiritual figure whose music had touched their lives in the deepest possible ways. As the final technical checks were completed and the moment of Michael's appearance approached, something unexpected began to happen in the crowd. Without any organization or prompting from the stage, without any cue from the sound system or instructions from the venue staff, the 907,000 people began to chant in unison, their voices joining together to create a sound that was audible for miles beyond the stadium, a human thunderclap that seemed to make the very ground beneath Rio de Janeiro tremble with collective emotion. "King of Pop, forever," they chanted, the words rolling across the crowd like waves across an ocean, each repetition growing stronger and more unified as more voices joined the spontaneous tribute. "King of Pop forever, King of Pop forever." The chant continued, building in volume and intensity until it seemed to fill not just the stadium, but the entire city, a declaration of love and recognition that transcended language barriers and cultural differences to become something primal and universal. The sound of nearly 1 million people acknowledging the presence of someone they believed had changed their lives through the power of his art. The chant was not in English, though the words were English. It was not in Portuguese, though most of the voices belonged to native Portuguese speakers. It had become something entirely new, a hybrid language created by the collision of cultures and emotions, a sound that belonged to no single nation or tradition, but to the space between them where music makes all boundaries irrelevant. The stadium's concrete structure amplified and focused the sound, turning the venue into a massive instrument played by the voices of nearly 1 million people who had spontaneously decided to create their own opening act for the artist they had come to see. Michael heard the chant from his position in the tunnel, and those who were with him watched as his expression transformed from the focused concentration of pre-performance preparation to something more vulnerable and more profound. Tears began to form in his eyes as the reality of what he was hearing settled into his consciousness. The understanding that nearly 1 million people had traveled from across a continent to express their gratitude for the music he had created, for the joy he had brought to their lives, for the way his art had provided soundtrack and meaning to their most important moments. "They're singing for you," whispered Frank Dilio, his manager, though the words seemed inadequate to describe what was actually happening. This was not singing in any conventional sense. This was something closer to prayer, to invocation, to the kind of collective expression that happens when individual voices merge to become something larger than the sum of their parts. The chant had taken on a life of its own, no longer requiring conscious effort from the participants, but flowing through them like a river of sound that connected nearly 1 million strangers in a moment of shared purpose and shared love. As Michael walked toward the stage entrance, the chant grew even louder, as if the crowd could sense his approaching presence, even though he remained invisible to them. The production crew monitoring the sound levels reported readings that exceeded anything they had previously recorded, volume levels that pushed their equipment to its limits and created acoustic phenomena that would be studied by sound engineers for years to come. But the most remarkable aspect of the chant was not its volume, but its unity, the way that nearly 1 million individual voices had found a way to speak as one, creating harmony without any conductor, rhythm without any metronome, music without any instruments beyond the human voice and the human heart. When Michael finally appeared on stage, emerging from beneath the platform in a cloud of silver smoke, while pyrotechnics painted the evening sky with colors that seemed to mirror the sunset over Guanabara Bay, the chant transformed into something even more powerful. The words "King of Pop Forever" gave way to a roar of pure emotion that seemed to come from the deepest places in human consciousness, a sound that was part celebration, part gratitude, part recognition of the sacred nature of the moment they were all sharing together. Michael stood center stage for nearly 5 minutes, without moving, without speaking, simply absorbing the energy that flowed toward him from nearly 1 million people who had created their own cathedral of sound in his honor. His sequined jacket caught the stage lights and scattered them across the crowd like blessings, while the massive video screens displayed his image to those too far away to see him with their naked eyes, creating the illusion that he was simultaneously present and omnipresent, human-sized and larger than life, intimate and epic. Then, in a gesture that would be remembered and replicated at concerts around the world for decades to come, Michael placed his right hand over his heart and slowly raised his left hand toward the crowd, palm open, fingers spread, as if he were trying to physically touch each of the nearly 1 million people who had gathered to see him. The gesture was simple, almost childlike in its directness, but it carried a weight of meaning that transformed the entire atmosphere of the stadium, changing the dynamic from performer and audience to something more reciprocal, more human, more real. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. The roar that had greeted his appearance gave way to something softer but more profound, a collective intake of breath that seemed to draw all the sound out of the stadium and replace it with a silence so complete it felt sacred. In that silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the streets of Rio and the gentle whisper of evening wind through the stadium's upper reaches, nearly 1 million people experienced a moment of perfect connection with a small figure on the distant stage who had somehow managed to make them all feel seen, acknowledged, loved. Then Michael began to speak, his voice carried by the massive sound system to every corner of the venue and beyond, his words simple but carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "I love you, Rio," he said, his distinctive whisper amplified until it seemed to come not from the stage but from the air itself. I love you more than words can express. You have given me something tonight that I will carry with me for the rest of my life." The crowd erupted again, but this time the sound was different, more varied, more complex. Some people cheered, others cried. Many did both simultaneously. Throughout the vast audience, strangers embraced each other, sharing the overwhelming emotion of the moment with whoever happened to be standing nearby. Elderly people who had saved for months to afford tickets stood next to teenagers who had skipped school to be present, their differences in age and background rendered irrelevant by their shared participation in something that transcended ordinary entertainment to become a moment of collective transcendence. But Michael was not finished. Still holding his hand over his heart, he began to remove items from his costume, starting with the military jacket that had become his signature look for this tour. He folded the jacket carefully, ceremoniously, then held it high above his head so that even those in the furthest reaches of the stadium could see it through the video screens. The symbolism was immediately understood by everyone present. This was not just a costume change. It was an offering, a gift from the performer to the audience that had given him such an overwhelming demonstration of their love. "This jacket," Michael said, his voice growing stronger with emotion, "has traveled with me around the world. It has been on stage in London, in New York, in Tokyo, in every city where people have gathered to share music and joy together. Tonight, I wanted to stay here in Rio, to remain with the people who have shown me what it means to be truly loved." The jacket was passed from the stage to security personnel, who carried it into the crowd, where it would eventually make its way to a local children's hospital, becoming a permanent exhibit that would inspire young patients for generations to come. But the real power of the gesture was not in its ultimate destination, but in the act itself, in Michael's decision to give away something that had personal and professional value as a way of honoring the gift that the audience had given him through their presence and their spontaneous chant. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about the moments when music transcends entertainment to become a force of pure human connection. As the evening progressed and Michael moved through his performance, something magical began to happen in the crowd. The 907,000 people who had gathered as individual fans began to function as a single organism, their movements synchronized not by choreography, but by the shared rhythm of the music and the collective energy of their participation. When Michael moonwalked across the stage, nearly 1 million people swayed in unison. When he spun, they turned together. When he pointed toward different sections of the crowd, entire populations of people felt personally acknowledged, personally seen, personally loved. But the most powerful moment came during Michael's performance of Man in the Mirror, when he stood alone at the edge of the stage with only a single spotlight illuminating his figure against the darkness of the Brazilian night. As he sang the song's message about personal transformation and social responsibility, his voice seemed to carry not just across the stadium, but across time itself, reaching into the past and future of everyone present, touching the places where individual dreams connect with collective hopes for a better world. During the song's climactic moment, when Michael's voice soared into the high notes that had become his signature, something unprecedented happened. The 907,000 people in the audience began to sing along, but they were not singing the English lyrics they had memorized from his albums. Instead, they were singing in Portuguese, Spanish, indigenous languages, and languages that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the emotion of the moment, creating a multilingual choir that transformed Michael's song into something larger than any single artist could create, a collective prayer for transformation that belonged to everyone present and to the city of Rio itself. Michael stopped singing and simply listened, his hand still pressed to his heart, his face showing an expression of wonder and gratitude that was magnified by the video screens and transmitted to every person in the vast audience. For nearly 10 minutes, he stood in silence while nearly 1 million people sang his song back to him in their own languages, their own words, their own interpretation of his message about change and hope and the power of individual action to transform the world. When the song finally ended and the last voices faded into the Rio night, Michael did something that no one expected. He sat down on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side like a child sitting on a dock, and he began to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears of a performer playing a role, but the honest, unguarded tears of a human being overwhelmed by the generosity and love of his fellow humans. The massive video screens captured every detail of his emotion, sharing his vulnerability with nearly 1 million people who responded not with embarrassment or discomfort, but with their own tears, their own expressions of the deep emotion that comes from witnessing authentic human connection. "Thank you," Michael whispered into his microphone, the words barely audible, but somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the stadium. "Thank you for reminding me why I do this, why sing, why dance, why try to bring joy to the world. You have given me the greatest gift any artist can receive, the knowledge that music really can bring people together, really can heal wounds, really can make the world a little bit better." As the concert drew to its conclusion, and the time came for Michael to leave the stage, the 907,000 people who had shared this extraordinary evening began to chant again, but this time the words were different. Instead of "King of Pop Forever," they chanted "Thank you, Michael," in dozens of languages, creating a linguistic symphony that seemed to summarize not just the evening's experience, but the gratitude of an entire generation for the music that had provided soundtrack to their lives, comfort during difficult times, and joy during moments of celebration. Michael's final gesture of the evening was perhaps the most powerful of all. He removed his famous white sequin glove, the accessory that had become synonymous with his performances around the world, and he kissed it gently before throwing it into the crowd. The glove seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long time, suspended against the lights and the night sky like a white bird flying toward the nearly 1 million outstretched hands that reached for it, everyone hoping to catch this piece of music history, this tangible reminder of an evening that had transcended entertainment to become something approaching a religious experience. The glove was caught by Maria Santos, a 19-year-old nursing student from Sao Paulo who had worked 3 jobs to afford her ticket to the concert. She would later donate the glove to the Brazilian Music Museum, where it would be displayed alongside a recording of the evening's spontaneous chants and a collection of testimonies from people who had been present, their words describing how the experience had changed their understanding of music, of performance, of the power of collective human emotion to create moments of transcendence. In the years that followed, the concert at Maracanã Stadium would be remembered as one of the most significant live performances in music history, not just because of its record-breaking attendance, but because of the quality of connection that had been achieved between performer and audience. Music critics would analyze the technical aspects of the show, the innovative use of technology to reach such a massive crowd, the logistics of managing nearly 1 million people in a single venue. But for those who had been present, the significance was more personal and more profound. They had witnessed a demonstration of the power of music to create community among strangers, to bridge cultural and linguistic differences, to transform individual emotion into collective experience. They had seen an artist at the height of his fame choose vulnerability over invincibility, authenticity over performance, human connection over professional distance. They had participated in the creation of something that had never existed before and would never exist again, a moment when nearly 1 million people had functioned as a single instrument played by the hands of one small man who had somehow learned to touch the deepest places in human hearts. The hand that Michael had placed over his heart during that magical evening would become his signature gesture, replicated at concerts around the world as a symbol of the connection between performer and audience, between individual emotion and collective experience, between the personal and the universal aspects of musical expression. But for Michael himself, the gesture carried a more specific meaning. It was his way of honoring the memory of that July evening in Rio when 907,000 people had taught him that the greatest performances happen not when artists entertain audiences, but when audiences and artists create something beautiful together. When the boundary between performer and participant dissolves to create moments of pure human connection that remind everyone present of the reasons why music exists in the first place. The final image of that historic evening was captured by a photographer positioned high in the stadium's upper reaches, showing Michael's small figure on the vast stage, surrounded by the ocean of people who had gathered to honor him. His hands still pressed to his heart, his face still wet with tears, the Brazilian flag flying overhead in the gentle evening breeze. The photograph would become one of the most iconic images in music history, a visual reminder of the evening when nearly 1 million people proved that music really is a universal language, that love really can transcend cultural boundaries, and that sometimes the most powerful performances happen when artists and audiences choose to create magic together rather than simply consuming entertainment separately.